How did the Jews survive the medieval period? How did the Jews survive? What is it that gave them the tremendous perseverance to last throughout this millennial diaspora? I will stipulate for the court, so to speak, that we're not going to discuss the theological basis for Jewish survival. It's a fascinating discussion, but a little bit outside my ken as a historian. You know, I can put on my rabbi hat, even though I'm not a rabbi, and we could discuss that. But I think I'll do that offline. Right now, let's try and work with the rules of history as we understand them and try to figure out what were the mechanisms that allowed the Jews to survive an otherwise incredibly inhospitable period. Everybody knows the joke, right? What's the definition of a Jewish holiday? They tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat, right? That's the, none of you have to laugh because we're all so familiar with it, but it is, it's a gross oversimplification, and yet it has a certain je ne sais quoi. It has a certain amount of, you know, truth to it. Let's just try to understand that a little bit. So one of the most traditional ways to approach Jewish history has been termed the lachrymose approach. It was Salo Whitmire Baron, one of the greatest historians of the 20th century, who coined this phrase. The word lachrymose means full of tears. That, you know, you look back in Jewish history and it is just one tragedy after another. Viewed from the perspective of the late 20th century in particular, after the Holocaust, my gosh, the tragedies just seem to get worse and worse and worse, and there's a lot to be said for that. Detractors of the lachrymose approach sometimes called it the books and pogroms view of Jewish history, in the sense that, you know, the Jews are like essentially studiously working on intellectual attainments, and they write these amazing books, and then they are, you know, horribly persecuted with pogroms, and then they go back and they write more of these books, and then they're persecuted again with pogroms. Now, I'm not saying that's not what happened. These things definitely did happen, but is it the most productive way to understand the patterns of medieval Jewish history? I'm not so sure. There is definitely, however, what to cry about. The lachrymose approach is certainly not a figment of our imagination. You know, sometimes when a person says he's paranoid, there really are people out to get him. When you look at the scope of the Middle Ages, extending from the diaspora at the Bar Kokhba period up until the Great Expulsion from Spain, you know, we've got series of expulsions. We've got long lists of discriminatory laws passed against Jews. We've got these horrific charges like blood libels. I mean, what a mashugana thing to suggest, and yet, as this particular image indicates, not only the blood libels, but the even more bizarre, you know, host desecration arguments resulted in Jews being massacred. And then perhaps the worst of the entire medieval period, the purge-like environment of the Inquisition. When we come back after the break and we look at the Sephardic diaspora, one of the most terrifying things of the Inquisition is that when Jews left Spain, they were not left alone. Anytime they landed in a Catholic territory, they were subject to the depredations of the Inquisition. So there's no question the lachrymose approach of medieval Jewish history has a lot of merit. It should not be tossed out the window. There is, however, I think, corrective lenses that can be applied to understand this in a little bit more sophisticated way. And one of the questions that really opens up the entire area is, you know, if it was really that bad, if it was just unrelenting persecution, why weren't the Jews simply massacred out of existence, God forbid, so many times before in history? The term genocide was actually coined only after the Holocaust by a Jewish man named Raphael Lemkin, and he was searching for a word to try and describe what the Holocaust meant, because the Holocaust was such a historical novum. It was something totally unprecedented. And we had no comparable example of any organized group of people, particularly at the state level, bending their entire bureaucratic engines toward destruction to the idea that an entire culture should be systematically wiped out. Historically, there have been lots and lots of massacres, lots and lots of expulsions, but the idea of genocide, the idea of something like the Holocaust, completely new. It's only in the 20th century. Jews, of course, are not the only victims of genocides, although they tend to be the, kind of like the most well-known and often cited example in the Holocaust. But many others, the Roma in the Holocaust as well, the Armenians, a lot of discussion about their treatment at the hands of the Turks, the Ukrainians in the Soviet period with the Holodomor, some incredibly horrible things are happening to so many peoples. Why do we only see that in the 20th century? Why don't we see those things happening earlier? So let's come back to this question. And I think to answer it, or at least to approach answering it, I'm going to introduce you to something that I like to call the Abramson rule of history. It's just something I say to please myself. I do find that undergraduates tend to remember it, and I've run into students like 20, 30 years later, and this is like one of the few things they remember from any of my classes. I tend to put it always on the final exam, so, be ready. The Abramson rule of history, which again, it's not really an Abramson rule, it's more like a Karl Marx rule, but the rule is that if you don't know why a particular historical phenomenon exists, the answer probably is money. Right? So when you're in doubt, just answer money. And I think that if we step away from the lachrymose perspective a little bit, and we try to understand why were the Jews allowed to exist, why nobody really thought of genocide until a much later period of time, it's because the Jews were useful. There are lots of ways in which, even though people might have had, a xenophobic attitude to Jews, they may have had a religious antipathy to Jews, they may have had a lot of reasons why, for good or ill, they did not like Jews. The Jews were very useful, and quite often useful to essential elements in society. The Jews were, I think, in many ways, ironically, saved by their own diaspora, because for the purposes of Jewish living in a diaspora, they needed to be urbanized, right? It's very difficult to live as a minority if you're going to be agrarian. You have to, there are certain communal functions that you have to have within walking distance, a ritual bath, a mikvah, a synagogue, and as you know, I like to say, you have to have an Asian restaurant within walking distance. How can you possibly have a community if you can't have walking distance to Asian food? That's a joke. So the Jews tended to congregate in urban centers, sometimes villages, sometimes cities. By the time we get to the 19th and 20th century, Jews are, around 30% of the population of many large cities like Warsaw in Poland. And in their urban environment, they tend to develop urban skills that require literacy and numeracy, and they're very, very valuable skills. Jews as doctors, highly prized, even to this very day, very strong tradition of Jews in medicine. Linguistic skills make Jews especially useful as diplomats, or on a lower level, simply middlemen, being able to communicate with peoples of different cultures, to engage in travel, engage in trade, and of course, as we discussed a few weeks ago, money lending. They're urban, they're able to make financial calculations, and the unusual phenomenon of a ban on Christian money lending creates a unique economic niche for the Jews that allows them to flourish. So even if we think about all of the built up hatred that was directed at Jews over the course of the Middle Ages, we see that they possess a lot of valuable skills that many sectors in society continue to value. In the case of money lending in particular, we see that they derive the protection of the king himself as the servi camerae regis, the servants of the royal chamber that we discussed when we talked about finance, because they're the only people in society who are able to generate cash on a regular basis, particularly because society is so deeply invested in a pre-modern economy with lots of barter. The Jews are the ones who are actually, generating cash that can be taxed by the king. And so the king doesn't want to see anything happen to these Jews. They are quite literally the cash cow. Jews are early on involved in minting and in the production of money. And this is at the same time their salvation, because it makes them useful to society, and at the same time it is a source of significant resentment that is directed against them. So even though we do see this lachrymose model happening, there's no question that the Jews have certain advantages that they have cultivated over the centuries with their long history of urbanization that makes them, quite adaptable to the necessities of a medieval period. And let us not forget that from the religious perspective as well, there are lots of reasons why Jews were actually protected. One of my teachers in university is a Professor Alan Davies, who was a specialist in the history of church anti-Semitism, and he liked to say that in reality, it was the church that protected the Jews for about 1,500 years. Now, I don't think he was really aware of the Abramson rule of history. Of course, I was an undergraduate, maybe a precocious one, but I don't think I had fully fleshed out that theory at the time. But I think he had a real point, and that is because both the church and the mosque developed a religious modus vivendi with the Jews. Again, it's possible, especially in certain periods like 13th century Europe, that if the church had its way, maybe we would see something a little bit more drastic than the horrible persecution that they endured. But the fact is, the demand for the Jewish presence, primarily because of their economic value, had to find its expression in a religious modus vivendi, a way of living with them. And so we have two doctrines that are ironic parallels to each other that carve out a little space for Jews to live in both Islamic North Africa and Middle East and in Christian Europe. For the Muslims, it is the Pact of Umar, which, although by 21st century standards obviously quite discriminatory, but viewed from the perspective of the Jews, it meant that there was like a legal space for them to exist. As long as they accepted the disabilities of their dhimmi status, which included, for example, a punitive tax rate that was not applied to Muslims, and from time to time they had certain restrictions on their clothing, their architecture, their settlement, and even with all of these rules, there were the occasional punctuations of violence that went beyond what the Pact of Umar allowed, but it still provided sort of like a medieval charter of rights for Jews. Not the same rights as Muslims, but certainly the right to exist, the right to be secure in their worship within boundaries, and this actually preserved the Jews. Similarly, the doctrine of witness, which we saw in Christian Europe, really being articulated by people like St. Augustine, and especially defended by important popes like Gregory the Great, said that, hey, for our own religious reasons, we need to keep the Jews alive until the second coming so they can be a witness to the return of Jesus. Right? So this is a very important reason why the Jews could not be killed, why they could not be subject to genocidal impetuses, because I wonder if the plural of impetuses is impeti. Probably not. Sorry for getting distracted by that. But the doctrine of witness said that it would be completely inappropriate to, God forbid, massacre the Jews, or even to convert them forcibly to Christianity. Now, as we saw also with Islam, perhaps on a much greater scale in Christianity, there were times when this sort of theological justification for limited tolerance wore thin, and you did have episodes of forced conversions, episodes of massacres, but on the whole, the doctrine of witness held fast. And the Jews were ironically protected by both the mosque and the church because they had this sort of safe space in which to live. When we return to our question of genocide in the 20th century, it is only when the power of religion declines so dramatically from the 18th century onward that these kinds of religious justifications simply have no longer any hold on the modern mind, especially on the postmodern mind, right? It reminds me of that phrase in the Talmud, leis din veles dayan, or maybe it's leis dayan veles din. There is no judge and there is no judgment, right? Christians, for example, are always, even when they may be, built up into a paroxysm of anger over a blood libel charge or something like that, they still have in the back of their mind, thou shalt not kill. That is still part of Christianity, of course, derived from Judaism. But when you say, there is no fundamental document, there is no prime revelatory experience that people can look back to as a sense of ultimate responsibility, that's when a genocide really is possible. It's only, ironically, really possible in a secular intellectual environment, God forbid. So these ideas of the Pacte of Umar and Doctrine of Witness, they don't work in modernity anymore, and helps to explain the unfortunate huge increase in the savagery of violence against Jews and against other minorities that we have experienced in the last couple hundred years. Okay, with that, I want to bring this semester to a close. I want to thank you very much for your patience and your endurance. I'm really looking forward to when we come back together, and we're going to start right away with the Sephardic diaspora, and then we're going to continue through the modern age, which is just simply so many more fascinating chapters in the millennial history of the Jewish people. Thank you again for being with me.